The door to the little diner swung open with a jingle, the sound almost drowned out by the hum of the coffee machine and the quiet chatter of the regulars. It was a crisp morning, the kind that made you pull your jacket a little tighter, but not cold enough to keep people inside. The same faces came and went like clockwork, their routines as predictable as the breakfast specials on the chalkboard. But today, something felt different. Emma, the waitress, caught a glimpse of a figure through the window, a man standing outside with his hands stuffed deep into the pockets of a threadbare coat. He looked out of place, like a shadow cast by the world outside, disconnected from the warmth inside. He was homeless, no surprise there, but something about him made Emma pause. His face was unshaven, his clothes old and tattered, but his eyes held a quiet intensity, as if they had witnessed things she couldn't even begin to imagine. She shook the thought away. There were always people like him, drifters, dreamers, lost souls. It wasn't her problem. She had her own life to worry about. "Morning, Emma," the cook, Tom, called from behind the counter, his voice as gruff as usual. "Morning, Tom," she replied, forcing a smile. Her hands were busy as she wiped down the counter, trying to shake off the feeling that had settled in her chest. She couldn't explain it, but that man standing outside felt different. The bell jingled again as the man stepped inside, his presence somehow heavy, filling the small space. His eyes scanned the diner, settling on the booth by the window. He moved slowly, cautiously, like a man who had long ago learned to tread lightly in the world. Emma didn't want to stare, but she couldn't help it. There was something about him, something that tugged at her curiosity. She turned away before he could catch her eye, grabbing the notepad from her apron and forcing herself to focus on the usual orders. "Can I help you?" she asked, her voice steady despite the flutter in her stomach. It wasn't that she was afraid. It was just that, well, she wasn't used to people like him. Not in this town. The man gave a small nod, his voice low and hoarse. "Just a coffee, please." Emma hesitated for a moment, wondering if he'd ask for something more. She had dealt with plenty of people asking for free food in the past, and she wasn't in the mood to start a scene. But then, his gaze softened. No begging, no demands. Just a quiet request. "Sure, I'll bring it right over," she said, turning to walk back to the counter. She couldn't help but glance back at him as she filled the coffee pot. He hadn't said anything else, hadn't even looked at the menu. He sat there, waiting, like he was used to waiting for things that never came. Emma shook her head, reminding herself not to get involved. But something about him was making it hard to stay detached. She set the coffee cup down in front of him, and for the first time, their eyes met. The man's gaze was intense yet kind, as if he saw her in a way no one else did. It made her feel exposed, vulnerable, even. But there was something else there too, an unspoken understanding, like two people stranded on the same island in the middle of an endless ocean. "Thanks," he said softly, his voice rough but sincere. Emma nodded, her hands feeling a little shaky as she backed away. She forced herself to smile. "No problem." But as she turned to walk away, a thought hit her, uninvited and unexpected. What if helping him, just this once, changed everything? What if this was the moment that made her life take a completely different direction? She pushed the thought away quickly. She couldn't afford to get caught up in the lives of people like him. She had her own struggles, her own goals. Still, she couldn't shake the feeling that something had just shifted, something she couldn't quite name. What if helping a stranger really did change everything? Emma stared at the coffee pot in her hands, her mind racing. Would she look back on this moment and wish she had done more? Or would this just be another passing encounter, a fleeting moment in time? She didn't know, but as she watched the man sip his coffee, something told her this was only the beginning. What do you think? Would you have helped the homeless man, even if you were unsure of who he really was? Share your thoughts in the comments. The sun was low in the sky as Emma scrubbed down the counter, the rhythm of the cloth against the surface calming her thoughts. The diner was quiet now, with only a few patrons finishing their meals. The man had long since left, the only sign of him a half-empty cup of coffee on the table. She didn't know why she was still thinking about him. He was just another face in a sea of faces that came and went. But there was something different about him. something that made Emma's heart tighten in a way she couldn't explain. She glanced at the clock. Just one more hour until her shift was over. Another day to get through. Another day of serving food, taking orders, and pretending everything was fine. Emma had never been a dreamer. Life had a way of making sure of that. She had grown up in a small town, the kind of place where everyone knew everyone else's business. It wasn't glamorous, but it was comfortable. Or so she'd thought, until the day her mother had passed away. She had been 15, still trying to figure out who she was, when her mom had been diagnosed with cancer. A quick diagnosis, and then the rapid decline. Emma had watched her mother fade away, helpless to stop it. After her mom died, everything had changed. Her dad, once a quiet man with a dry sense of humor, became a shell of himself, drowning in the grief that Emma couldn't fix. She had tried to hold it together, but it had been hard. So hard. She dropped out of school to take care of him, her dreams put on hold. There were no scholarships, no college applications. Just the cold reality of bills piling up and a life that wasn't going anywhere. It wasn't until she turned 20 that she had managed to escape. She left home and moved to the city, finding work at the diner. The pay wasn't much, but it was enough to get by. Enough to keep a roof over her head and food in her stomach. But something inside her still felt empty. Like there was more she was supposed to be doing, more she was meant to accomplish. She wasn't sure what that more was, but she couldn't shake the feeling that there was something out there waiting for her. And yet, here she was, serving coffee and scrambled eggs to people who came in, ordered, and left without a second thought. Not exactly the life she had imagined. Her sister, Lily, was the one who constantly told her to dream bigger, to take risks. Lily had always been the adventurous one, the one who moved across the country without a plan, the one who was never afraid to try something new. She'd visited Emma last month, sitting across from her at the counter, shaking her head at Emma's quiet, predictable life. "Come on, Em," Lily had said, slinging an arm over her sister's shoulders. "You've got so much more in you. You just have to take a chance. You deserve better than this." Emma had laughed it off at the time, but the words lingered. She knew Lily was right. Emma did deserve better. But how? Where would she even begin? She wiped the counter again, not really seeing it. Her eyes kept drifting to the table where the man had sat, the empty cup still sitting there, an unfinished story. "Hey, you all right?" Emma snapped back to reality. Tom was standing at the counter, eyeing her with that concerned look he reserved for moments like this. "Yeah, just thinking," she replied, giving him a half-smile. "I'm good." Tom shrugged. "Well, don't think too much. The world's a tough place, and thinking too much about it won't make it easier. You just have to keep going." Emma nodded, but in the back of her mind, something was shifting. Something had changed when the homeless man had walked into the diner, and she couldn't ignore it. She had helped him, but it felt like it was her who had been given something. Maybe it was just hope, maybe it was just a spark, but something had awakened in her. She didn't know what it was yet, but she was beginning to wonder if it was the start of something new, something bigger. Do you think sometimes the smallest acts of kindness can change our own perspective on life? Have you ever experienced something like this? Let us know in the comments. The next morning, Emma arrived early for her shift. She wasn't sure why she felt the need to get there early, but she couldn't shake the feeling that today would be different. Maybe it was the sense of possibility that lingered from the day before, the strange connection she'd felt with the homeless man. Maybe it was just wishful thinking. Either way, she couldn't ignore it. The diner was still dark when she walked in, the smell of fresh coffee filling the air as she turned on the lights and started setting up. There was a chill in the air, the kind of cold that made you wrap your arms around yourself for warmth. It wasn't unusual. Winter was settling in, and the city was starting to feel it. Tom was already in the kitchen, frying bacon and eggs. He barely looked up as Emma entered, just giving her a grunt of acknowledgement. She had grown used to Tom's gruff demeanor. He wasn't the type to make small talk, but he was reliable, and in this line of work, that was enough. It wasn't until about mid-morning that the bell above the door jingled again, and Emma's heart skipped a beat. There, standing in the doorway, was the same homeless man from yesterday. He looked just as worn as before, but there was something different about him today. His eyes weren't as distant, and though his clothes were still ragged, There was a subtle shift in the way he carried himself. Maybe it was just her imagination, but he seemed calmer, more settled. Emma froze for a moment, unsure of what to do. The familiar impulse to ignore him bubbled up, but something told her not to. She didn't know what it was. Maybe it was the lingering memory of their brief conversation, or maybe it was the nagging thought that this man wasn't just another face passing through her life. But whatever it was, it pushed her to take action. "Coffee?" she asked, her voice sounding more uncertain than she intended. He nodded, his gaze meeting hers with a quiet intensity. "Please." Emma hesitated before turning to the counter, grabbing the coffee pot. She was surprised by how natural it felt to help him again, even though she didn't really know why he was here or what he wanted. As she poured the coffee, she found herself stealing glances at him. His face was weathered, but there was a quiet dignity in the way he held himself. Despite the rough exterior, there was something about him that made her want to know more. What was his story? What had brought him here? She placed the cup in front of him, her hands briefly touching his as she did. It was a simple gesture, but it felt like a silent understanding passed between them. He didn't speak at first, just took a slow sip, his eyes never leaving hers. "Thank you," he said after a moment, his voice low but sincere. "You're welcome," Emma replied, surprised by how easily the words came. She wasn't used to having conversations with people like him, not outside of the normal customer service exchanges. But there was something real about this moment, something that made her want to open up. As she turned to walk back to the counter, she caught herself thinking, what if I could help him more than just with a cup of coffee? The thought shocked her. Why should she get involved? She didn't have the time, and it wasn't her responsibility. She had enough to worry about already. But before she could push the thought aside, the man spoke again, this time with a hint of vulnerability that caught her off guard. "You ever wonder what it would be like if we just stopped?" he asked, his voice quiet but compelling. Emma paused, her back to him as she wiped down the counter. "Stopped what?" "Stopped pretending. Stopped pretending we have it all figured out," he said. "You know life. We go through the motions day after day, but we don't really live." Emma didn't know what to say to that. She had never been one to open up about her own struggles, but his words felt like a challenge, like he was asking her to question everything she had taken for granted. She forced a smile, trying to brush it off. "I don't think we can just stop. The world doesn't work that way." He nodded, his gaze still on her. "Maybe not, but it's a thought." As Emma turned away, she couldn't shake the weight of his words. It was as if the man knew something about her life, that she hadn't even fully acknowledged herself. She tried to focus on the next order, but her mind kept drifting back to him. What if he was right? What if she had been pretending, just going through the motions without really living? She didn't know what the man's story was, but she felt a strange pull to find out. And as much as she tried to ignore it, a new question started to take root in her mind. What if this was the moment that could change everything? Have you ever had a moment where someone said something that made you question your whole perspective on life? How did it change you? Share your thoughts in the comments. The days that followed felt strange to Emma. It was as if she had unknowingly opened a door to a part of herself she hadn't known was there. The homeless man, whose name, she learned, was Jack, had started to show up at the diner every morning. At first, it was just the same routine. He would come in, order a coffee, and sit by the window, sipping his drink in silence. But as the days went by, Emma couldn't help but notice little things about him. He wasn't the type to beg or ask for anything more than what he was given. In fact, he hardly spoke unless spoken to. Yet there was a quiet strength about him, something that made Emma feel both intrigued and uneasy. One morning, as she refilled his cup, she found herself watching him more closely. He was always alone, never looking for company, yet never truly alone. There was a sadness in his eyes that made her wonder if he was running from something, or perhaps running towards something. "Jack," she said, placing the coffee pot down carefully on the counter. "What's your story?" For a moment, he didn't respond. He seemed to be considering her question, his gaze flickering between her and the window. "I don't have much of a story," he said finally, his voice quiet. "I'm just here, living day to day." Emma nodded, unsure how to respond. She wasn't looking for a sob story, just a glimpse into his life. But his response seemed to say everything. It was as if he had learned to live in the shadows, not wanting to burden anyone with his past. "Are you sure about that?" she asked, leaning slightly on the counter. "Everyone's got a story, don't they?" Jack looked at her then, a faint smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "Maybe, but sometimes it's easier to leave the story behind." There it was again, the same cryptic tone that made Emma's curiosity flare. She was starting to wonder if she was the one who was missing something, not him. She couldn't help herself. "You don't have to leave your story behind with me, you know." Jack's eyes softened, and for a moment, Emma felt like she had breached some kind of invisible wall between them. But then he stood up, the moment quickly slipping away as he adjusted his coat. "Thanks for the coffee," he said, his tone final. "Maybe some other time." He left before she could say anything else. Emma watched him walk out the door, the bell chiming softly behind him. She stood there for a moment, her mind swirling with a mixture of thoughts she couldn't quite put together. Why did he seem so different from the others who came and went through the diner every day? Why did she feel like there was more to him than just a homeless man looking for a hot cup of coffee? It wasn't long before Emma's thoughts were interrupted by Tom's gruff voice. "You think too much about people like him, Em." Emma turned to see Tom, wiping his hands on a dish towel. "What do you mean?" "You know what I mean," Tom said, giving her a pointed look. "People come and go. You can't save them all, kid." "I'm not trying to save him," Emma muttered, though even as she said it, she wasn't sure it was entirely true. "You don't have to. Just keep your head down, do your job. People like him. They'll figure things out eventually, or they won't." Emma didn't say anything. She wasn't sure how to respond to that. She wasn't exactly trying to save Jack, but there was something about him that made her want to know more. She glanced out the window, her gaze lingering on the street where Jack had disappeared into the morning fog. It was hard to shake the feeling that his story wasn't as simple as he made it out to be. There was something about him, something buried deep beneath the surface, that seemed to call out to her. And for the first time in a long time, Emma felt like she might actually be able to help. Maybe not in the way Tom was suggesting, but in a way that mattered to her. But how? She didn't know. She only knew that something had shifted. She couldn't unsee the man who had walked into her life, not knowing that he would change everything. Have you ever met someone who seemed to have a story that was buried deep inside them, but they weren't ready to share? What do you think makes some people so guarded? Share your thoughts in the comments. The days passed quickly, and Emma found herself increasingly preoccupied with Jack. Each morning, when she arrived at the diner, part of her hoped he would be there. The other part, more rational, more grounded, tried to convince her not to get too involved. He was a regular now, and every time he walked in, the old routine seemed to settle into place. But underneath it all, Emma couldn't shake the feeling that Jack was more than just a man with a hard life and a lost future. That Thursday morning, the diner had an unusual buzz. The coffee was brewing, the eggs were frying, and the usual chatter was filling the air. Yet, Emma couldn't help but notice the empty seat by the window, the one Jack always took. She told herself that it didn't matter. He might be late, or maybe he was just taking a day off. There were plenty of other regulars, plenty of other people to focus on. But that empty seat gnawed at her all morning. By late afternoon, just as Emma was getting ready to leave for the day, the bell above the door jingled softly. She turned around, her pulse quickening as she saw Jack standing in the doorway, his coat pulled tightly around him, as if trying to ward off the chill of the city outside. He didn't look his usual self. There was a weariness to his expression that Emma hadn't seen before. His eyes were sunken, his steps slower, as if he carried a weight on his shoulders that even the cold air outside couldn't ease. "Jack," Emma said, giving him a warm smile despite the fluttering unease in her chest. "I didn't expect to see you today. Is everything okay?" He didn't answer right away. He only nodded slightly, stepping into the diner with a sigh. Emma watched him as he walked to his usual seat, his movements slower than usual, his eyes scanning the room as if he were unsure whether he truly belonged. For a moment, she just watched him, unsure of what to say. He wasn't the type to share his problems with anyone, at least not the way most people did. But something was different today. He looked like a man who had reached the limit of his own endurance. Emma set down a cup of coffee in front of him, her hands steady but her heart racing. "I'm here," she said, her voice a little softer than usual. "I'm glad you're back." Jack looked up at her then, his eyes meeting hers for a brief, almost painful moment. Then he looked away, staring into his coffee. "I don't know what to do anymore," he said quietly, his voice low but filled with an emotion Emma couldn't quite place. "Everything feels like it's slipping away, and I don't know how to fix it." Emma's heart lurched. She sat down across from him without thinking, her hands wrapped tightly around her own coffee cup. "You don't have to fix anything," she said, her voice soft. "You just have to take things one step at a time." Jack shook his head, a hollow laugh escaping him. "That's the thing, Emma. I've been taking one step at a time for years, and I'm still stuck in the same place. I don't know how much longer I can keep going like this." Emma wanted to say something comforting, something that would make him feel better, but the truth was, she didn't have the answers. She couldn't fix his life any more than she could fix her own. But what she could do was listen, and sometimes that was enough. "I'm not asking you to fix it all at once," Emma said gently, "but maybe you don't have to do it alone. Maybe I can help." Jack's gaze flickered to hers, and for a brief moment, Emma thought she saw something change in his eyes, something more than just tiredness. There was a flicker of vulnerability there, something raw and real. "You don't know what you're offering," he said, his voice thick with an emotion Emma didn't know how to name. "I'm not the kind of person you help, Emma. People like me, we're used to being invisible." The word stung more than Emma cared to admit. She couldn't understand how someone could feel so small, so invisible. She wanted to argue, to tell him that he mattered, that he was worth more than he thought. But instead, she simply sat there, taking in his words. The silence stretched between them, thick with things unsaid. After a few minutes, Jack stood up, slipping a few crumpled bills onto the table. Emma didn't try to stop him. She knew he wasn't ready to talk anymore, not now. As he turned to leave, Emma felt a strange ache in her chest. There was something about Jack, something that made her want to keep trying to understand him, something that made her feel like maybe, just maybe, he wasn't as lost as he believed. "Jack," she called out, her voice a little more than a whisper. He paused, turning back toward her. "If you ever want to talk, I'm here." He gave her a brief, tired smile before disappearing through the door, the bell above it jingling softly as he left. Emma sat back down at the counter, her mind spinning with 1,000 questions. Who was this man? What had happened to him to make him feel so broken? And why, despite all the distance he put between them, did she feel so drawn to him? She didn't have answers, but she had a sense that something in her life was about to change, whether she was ready for it or not. Have you ever had someone in your life who felt invisible? Someone who was struggling and didn't know how to ask for help? What did you do for them? Or what would you have wanted to do for them? Share your thoughts in the comments. The days following Jack's departure were heavy with the weight of unspoken words. Emma couldn't stop thinking about him. What had he meant by saying he was invisible? And why had he so easily dismissed her offer to help, as though he didn't deserve kindness? Every time she walked into the diner, the feeling of his absence lingered. She told herself it was just the normal rhythm of the place, but it was more than that. Jack had somehow become a fixture in her mind, someone she couldn't shake, like a puzzle piece that didn't quite fit but that she couldn't stop trying to place. On Monday morning, after a long and grueling weekend shift, Emma arrived at the diner early again, hoping for a sense of normalcy. The bell above the door jingled as she entered, the familiar scent of fresh coffee and pancakes greeting her. The usual hum of chatter filled the air, but Jack was still missing. It wasn't until she took a quick break at around noon that she saw him again. He was sitting across the street, hunched over on the sidewalk near a park bench. He looked as though he had been there for a while, his shoulders slumped and his coat wrapped tightly around his body. The worn edges of his clothes, the way he stared into the distance, it all seemed so empty. Emma's first instinct was to look away, to pretend she hadn't seen him, but something in her chest tightened. She had offered help before, but he hadn't taken it. Yet here he was, looking as lost and broken as ever. She could no longer ignore the nagging feeling that she needed to do something, even if he wasn't asking. Without thinking too much, Emma grabbed her coat and stepped outside. Her footsteps were tentative at first, unsure of herself. She had no idea what she was going to say, but the distance between her and him felt unbearable. When she reached the park bench, Jack looked up, his tired eyes narrowing at her approach. He didn't speak, but the look he gave her was a mix of surprise and something darker, maybe shame, or perhaps resignation. "Jack," Emma said, her voice quieter than she intended. "Are you okay?" He didn't respond right away. His eyes lingered on her for a long moment, his lips pressed together in a thin line. Then, he sighed deeply, as though the weight of the world had finally become too much. "I'm just tired," he said softly, his voice barely above a whisper. "Tired of running. Tired of pretending everything's fine when it's not." Emma sat down beside him on the bench, her heart aching at the rawness of his words. She didn't know how to help him, not really, but she knew she couldn't just walk away. "Jack, you don't have to do this alone," Emma said, her voice steady despite the knot forming in her throat. "You can talk to me, if you want." For a moment, Jack didn't respond. He just sat there, looking down at his hands, his fingers fidgeting with the worn fabric of his coat. Emma waited patiently, not pushing him, just being there. "I've done things I'm not proud of," he said, his voice so low that Emma almost missed it. "Things that got me here. I thought I could fix it all on my own, but I can't. I don't know what to do anymore." Emma's heart clenched at his words. It was hard to imagine what kind of things he could have done, or how his life had led him to this point. But she knew that whatever it was, it didn't define him. People weren't their mistakes. "You don't have to carry it all by yourself," she said gently. "You can talk about it, and you don't have to fix it today. Just take it one step at a time." Jack shook his head, a bitter smile tugging at the corner of his lips. "You don't get it, Emma. There are some things you can't come back from." Emma leaned forward slightly, her voice soft but firm. "I don't know everything about you, Jack, but I know that no one is beyond redemption. And I know you're not invisible. Not to me." There was a long pause as Jack stared at the ground, his face unreadable. Emma wasn't sure if he was listening, or if he even believed her, but she had to say it. She couldn't let him continue to believe that he was beyond help. Finally, Jack spoke, his voice hoarse. "You're wasting your time. I don't deserve your kindness." Emma didn't answer right away. Instead, she just sat there beside him, letting the silence hang between them. Maybe she didn't have the answers, but she couldn't walk away. Not this time. "You know," Emma said after a long moment, "sometimes we think we have to do everything on our own, but that's not true. No one can do it alone. Not forever." Jack didn't respond, but he didn't walk away either. He just sat beside her, a quiet truce hanging in the air. After a while, Emma stood up, brushing off her coat. "I've got to get back to the diner," she said, her voice still soft. "But you don't have to be alone. I'm here whenever you're ready to talk." Jack didn't look at her when she left, but she felt like something had shifted, even if it was only a small step. When Emma walked back into the diner, she felt both heavier and lighter than before. Jack hadn't agreed to let her help, but at least he hadn't pushed her away completely. And that was enough for now. Have you ever felt like you were carrying something you couldn't share, something that was too heavy to put into words? How did you handle it? Do you think reaching out for help makes you weaker or stronger? Share your thoughts with us in the comments. The next few days felt like a quiet kind of waiting. Emma saw Jack every day, but he remained distant, closed off. He was a regular at the diner now, though his usual seat by the window was often empty. When he did show up, he'd sit quietly, barely making eye contact, and only spoke to Emma in short, clipped sentences. But there was a subtle shift in the way he looked at her, something unspoken. It was as if he was deciding whether or not to let her in. Emma, for her part, had decided not to push. She would wait, knowing that sometimes people had to come to their own conclusions. She couldn't rush him, and she wouldn't. One morning, Emma was setting up the counter when Jack walked in, his face drawn and his posture slumped. As usual, his eyes scanned the room for a seat. Emma's heart twisted. She couldn't help but feel responsible in some way. Responsible for helping him, or at the very least, not letting him slip away completely. He settled into his usual seat and stared at the menu for a long time, his fingers tapping the edge of the table nervously. Emma took a deep breath, then walked over to him with a soft smile. "Hey, Jack, what can I get you today?" Jack looked up at her, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he gave her a faint nod. "Just the usual, I guess," he said, his voice low and tired. As she walked away to prepare his order, Emma noticed the way Jack's eyes lingered on the coffee pot in front of him. His gaze was distant, almost like he wasn't even in the room anymore. For a moment, she considered whether or not it was worth trying to talk to him again. But the part of her that wanted to help, wanted to reach through the wall he'd built around himself, couldn't stay quiet for long. "Jack," she said as she set his coffee in front of him, her voice quieter than before. "If you want to talk, I'm still here." There was no immediate response. For a long, uncomfortable moment, Jack didn't speak. He just stared at his coffee. Emma was about to turn away when he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix it," he said, his words almost drowned out by the hum of the diner around them. "Everything feels like it's falling apart, and I don't know what to do anymore." Emma's heart tightened at the raw vulnerability in his voice. It was the first time he had opened up, even just a little. She pulled up a chair and sat down across from him, a safe distance, but enough to show that she wasn't going anywhere. "You don't have to fix everything right now, Jack," she said softly. "It's okay to just take things one day at a time. You don't have to carry everything alone." Jack's eyes flickered to hers for a split second before he looked away. He seemed torn. Part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to reach out, but another part of him was afraid of what it might mean to let someone in. "I don't even know where to start," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "There's so much I've done, so much I regret. I can't change it. I don't know how to." It was as if he was deciding whether or not to let her in. Emma, for her part, had decided not to push. She would wait, knowing that sometimes people had to come to their own conclusions. She couldn't rush him, and she wouldn't. One morning, Emma was setting up the counter when Jack walked in, his face drawn and his posture slumped. As usual, his eyes scanned the room for a seat. Emma's heart twisted. She couldn't help but feel responsible in some way, responsible for helping him, or at the very least, not letting him slip away completely. He settled into his usual seat and stared at the menu for a long time, his fingers tapping the edge of the table nervously. Emma took a deep breath, then walked over to him with a soft smile. "Hey, Jack, what can I get you today?" Jack looked up at her, his expression unreadable. After a long moment, he gave her a faint nod. "Just the usual, I guess," he said, his voice low and tired. As she walked away to prepare his order, Emma noticed the way Jack's eyes lingered on the coffee pot in front of him. His gaze was distant, almost like he wasn't even in the room anymore. For a moment, she considered whether or not it was worth trying to talk to him again. But the part of her that wanted to help, wanted to reach through the wall he'd built around himself, couldn't stay quiet for long. "Jack," she said as she set his coffee in front of him, her voice quieter than before. "If you want to talk, I'm still here." There was no immediate response. For a long, uncomfortable moment, Jack didn't speak. He just stared at his coffee. Emma was about to turn away when he finally spoke, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know how to fix it," he said, his words almost drowned out by the hum of the diner around them. "Everything feels like it's falling apart, and I don't know what to do anymore." Emma's heart tightened at the raw vulnerability in his voice. It was the first time he had opened up, even just a little. She pulled up a chair and sat down across from him, a safe distance, but enough to show that she wasn't going anywhere. "You don't have to fix everything right now, Jack," she said softly. "It's okay to just take things one day at a time. You don't have to carry everything alone." Jack's eyes flickered to hers for a split second before he looked away. He seemed torn. Part of him wanted to believe her, wanted to reach out, but another part of him was afraid of what it might mean to let someone in. "I don't even know where to start," he murmured, more to himself than to her. "There's so much I've done, so much I regret. I can't change it. I don't know how to." Jack had started coming to the diner more regularly, and though he remained quiet, Emma could see the subtle changes. He would stay longer, not just order his food and leave. Sometimes they would share small, unspoken moments. He'd nod to her when she refilled his coffee, or he'd glance at her when she passed by his booth, as if he was deciding whether to speak or not. One afternoon, after the lunch rush had died down, Emma found herself sitting across from him again. Jack had been quiet, as usual, but something about the way he held himself today felt different, more open, even if he wasn't saying much. The silence between them stretched on for what felt like an eternity, but Emma had learned to be patient. Finally, Jack broke the silence, his voice barely audible. "I'm sorry," he said, his gaze fixed on his coffee cup. "I know I've been hard to deal with. I didn't mean to make things complicated." Emma blinked, surprised by the admission. She had expected many things from Jack, but an apology wasn't one of them. She didn't respond right away. Instead, she let the moment sit, allowing Jack the space to continue. "I've been pushing people away for so long," he went on, his voice quieter now. "I don't know how to let anyone in anymore." "But you—" He stopped, his words trailing off. He swallowed hard, as if the weight of his confession was too much to carry. Emma leaned forward slightly, offering him a warm, understanding smile. "You don't need to apologize, Jack. I understand more than you think. People get hurt, and sometimes they don't know how to let anyone else in. But that doesn't mean it's too late." Jack glanced up at her, his expression filled with a mixture of gratitude and disbelief. For a moment, their eyes met, and in that silence, Emma could feel something shift. Maybe it was the start of him opening up, maybe it wasn't. But either way, she could see it. He was fighting an internal battle, one that Emma couldn't fight for him, but she could stand beside him as he fought it. "I don't even know who I am anymore," Jack confessed, his voice strained. "I used to be someone, but now? I don't recognize myself. I've done things that I regret, things I can never take back." Emma's heart ached at his words. She had always known there was more to Jack than met the eye, but hearing him admit it so openly left her speechless for a moment. "You don't have to be defined by the past, Jack," Emma said, her voice firm but gentle. "Who you were doesn't determine who you can become. It's not too late to change." Jack let out a hollow laugh, his fingers tapping nervously against the edge of his mug. "You don't get it. There are things I've done, things I can't undo. It doesn't matter how hard I try. I'll never escape them." Emma took a deep breath, trying to find the right words. Maybe it doesn't matter if you can undo the past. Maybe it's more about deciding what you want your future to look like. The choices you make now matter more than the things you've done before. For a long time, Jack didn't speak. He just sat there, staring at his coffee. Emma could tell that her words had struck a chord, but she wasn't sure if they were sinking in yet. It wasn't going to be easy for him to let go of the past. It never was for anyone. But at least he had started talking about it. That was something. Finally, Jack looked up at her, his face more tired than sad. "You really think I can change?" Emma nodded slowly. "I do. But only if you're willing to try. You don't have to do it all at once. Just take the first step. Let people in. Let me in." Jack's eyes flickered with uncertainty. He opened his mouth to say something, then closed it again. The battle between wanting to believe her and the weight of his past was clearly waging inside of him. "I don't know if I can trust anyone anymore," he said, his voice thick with emotion. "I've been hurt too much." "I understand," Emma said, her voice steady. "But you don't have to do this alone. You don't have to trust all at once. You can take it slow, one small step at a time." Jack looked at her for a long moment, his eyes searching hers as if looking for some kind of answer. Finally, he sighed, a sound that felt like a release, even if only a small one. Maybe I can try," he said softly. Emma smiled at him, the smallest of smiles, but it was enough to feel like progress. "That's all I'm asking. Just one step." As Jack finished his coffee and prepared to leave, he didn't rush out like he usually did. He lingered for a moment longer, glancing at Emma. Then, with a nod of gratitude, he stood up and left. But this time, the tension in his shoulders seemed just a little bit lighter. Have you ever been in a situation where you felt like the past was holding you back? How did you take the first step toward healing? Share your story in the comments. Jack's visits became a little more frequent over the next few days. He wasn't quite opening up like Emma had hoped, but she could sense the subtle changes. He seemed a little lighter each time, his shoulders less hunched, his smile a little more genuine, even if it was brief. Emma had learned to read the small victories. She couldn't rush him, but each tiny shift was a sign that he was trying, even if he didn't know it yet. One rainy afternoon, as the diner buzzed with the usual midday crowd, Emma spotted Jack walking in, his coat soaked from the downpour. He looked tired, like the weight of the world was still pressing down on him. She knew something was different about him today. There was a heaviness in his stride that told her something was on his mind. He sat down at his usual booth by the window, his eyes staring out into the gray rain. For a moment, Emma hesitated. She had learned not to intrude on his space, but she couldn't ignore the pull to check in with him, especially when he seemed more withdrawn than usual. Taking a deep breath, she made her way to his booth, setting down a warm cup of coffee before him. "Hey, Jack," she said softly, her tone careful. "You look like you've got a lot on your mind." Jack glanced up, surprised by her words, as if he hadn't expected her to notice. He took a sip of his coffee, the steam swirling around his face as he thought. "I've been thinking about everything," he said after a long pause, his voice low. "About what you said about letting people in. I've tried, but every time I do, it feels like I just end up messing everything up." Emma sat down across from him, not saying a word, just letting him talk. She could see the frustration on his face, the inner turmoil he was fighting. "I can't change the things I've done," Jack continued, his voice tightening with emotion. "I can't undo the damage. And the people I've hurt, I don't think they'll ever forgive me." Emma's heart ached at his words. She had known Jack was carrying something heavy, but hearing him express the depth of his regret made her realize just how much he had been punishing himself. "You can't change the past, Jack," she said gently, her voice steady. "But you can choose what to do next. It's not about erasing what you've done. It's about showing up and doing better now. People might not forgive you right away, but they'll see the change in you. That's what matters." Jack was quiet for a moment, his gaze fixed on the coffee cup in his hands. Then, slowly, he looked up at her, his eyes filled with uncertainty. "I don't know if I can do that," he admitted. "What if I try and fail? What if they still see me as the person I used to be?" Emma reached across the table, placing a hand on his. The gesture was small, but it felt like the weight of everything she had been trying to say was in that simple touch. "Trying is enough," she said firmly. "It's not about being perfect. It's about being real and being willing to change. I know it's hard, but you're not alone in this. You have to trust that you can move forward, one step at a time." Jack didn't respond immediately. Instead, he sat back in his seat, lost in thought. Emma watched him closely, sensing that the battle inside him was far from over. But there was a flicker in his eyes now, a small spark of hope, if only for a moment. For the first time, Jack seemed to truly hear her. Maybe he didn't have all the answers, but at least he was beginning to believe that there was a possibility for something different. And that, Emma realized, was all she could ask for. As Jack stood up to leave, he paused at the door, his hand resting on the handle. He turned to Emma, his face a mixture of gratitude and uncertainty. "Thanks," he said, his voice barely above a whisper. "I don't know if I'll ever be able to fix everything, but maybe I can try. Maybe I can start over." Emma smiled softly, the weight of his words hanging in the air between them. It wasn't the resolution she had hoped for, but it was a start. "That's all anyone can ask for, Jack," she said, her voice warm. "A fresh start. And I'll be here, every step of the way." Jack gave her a small nod before walking out into the rain, his figure disappearing into the storm. Emma watched him go, her heart full. She didn't know what the future held for him or for them, but she knew one thing. He was starting to believe that he could change. And that belief, she realized, was the first step to healing. Have you ever struggled with moving past your mistakes? What helped you take the first step toward healing? Share your thoughts below. The next few days felt different. The diner was bustling with the usual hum of conversations, clinking plates, and the sizzle of the grill, but for Emma, it was quieter. She had a sense of anticipation, as though something was about to happen, but she couldn't quite put her finger on it. Jack hadn't come by since their last conversation. She didn't want to push him, but she couldn't help wondering if he had taken her words to heart, or if they had simply disappeared into the vastness of his troubled mind. It was late in the afternoon when the door to the diner opened with its usual jingle. Emma looked up instinctively, expecting the usual rush of customers. But there, standing in the doorway, was Jack. He wasn't drenched in rain this time, and his expression was different. He looked more composed, like a weight had been lifted, even if only slightly. His eyes met hers across the room, and for the first time in a long while, Emma saw something in him she hadn't seen before. Vulnerability, but with a flicker of hope. Without a word, Jack made his way to the booth by the window, the same place he had always sat, and slid into the seat. Emma felt a jolt of anticipation. She wasn't sure what this moment meant, but she knew it was important. She took a deep breath, setting down the coffee pot she had been holding, and made her way over to his table. As she approached, she noticed that he wasn't hunched over like usual. His posture was more relaxed, and there was an almost imperceptible shift in the way he carried himself. He seemed lighter. "Hey, Jack," Emma greeted him, her voice warm but casual. "It's good to see you." Jack looked up, a small, tired smile crossing his face. "Yeah, I guess it is." Emma sat down across from him, watching him carefully. "You've been quiet lately. Everything okay?" Jack took a deep breath, his fingers tapping against the edge of the table. He seemed to be gathering his thoughts, trying to decide whether he should open up or retreat into his usual shell. But there was a shift in the air, a crack in his armor that Emma couldn't ignore. He was choosing to speak. "I've been thinking a lot," he said quietly, looking out the window for a moment, his gaze distant. "About what you said, about letting people in. I thought I could do this on my own, that I didn't need anyone." Emma didn't interrupt, knowing this was the moment she had been waiting for. She could feel his walls starting to crumble, piece by piece. "But the truth is," Jack continued, his voice unsteady but determined, "I've been fooling myself. I've been holding on to the past for so long, thinking it would protect me, but all it's done is keep me trapped. I've hurt people. I've hurt myself, and I don't know how to fix it." Emma's heart tightened as she listened. She had known he was struggling, but hearing him admit it, seeing the rawness in his eyes, made everything feel more real. She reached across the table, her hand resting on his. "You don't have to fix it all at once," she said softly. "The past doesn't have to define you. You can start now. You can make different choices." Jack looked down at her hand for a moment, almost as if he were weighing the sincerity of her words. Then, slowly, he lifted his gaze to meet hers, his eyes searching hers as if asking for reassurance. "I don't even know where to start," he confessed, his voice barely above a whisper. "I feel like I've messed up so badly that no one will ever see me as anything but the person I was. I've burned too many bridges." Emma smiled gently. "You're not alone in that. We all make mistakes. We all have things we regret. The difference is whether we choose to keep moving forward. If you want to change, if you want to be a better person, it's not too late. But you have to be willing to try." Jack was quiet for a long time, his eyes fixed on her hand resting on the table. He seemed to be processing everything, as though deciding if he could take the first step. After a moment, he let out a soft sigh and pulled his hand back. "I don't know if I can ever make up for the things I've done," he said quietly, his voice laced with defeat. "But I want to try. For once, I want to see if I can be someone else." Emma gave him a soft smile, feeling a flicker of hope deep inside her. That's all anyone can do. Try. For the first time in a long while, Jack seemed to believe her. The tension in his posture loosened slightly, and Emma could see the faintest glimmer of the man he was capable of becoming. She couldn't fix everything for him, but she could help him take that first step toward change. "You're not alone in this, Jack," Emma added, her voice steady. "You don't have to do it alone." Jack nodded, the hint of a smile tugging at the corners of his lips. He didn't say anything in response, but there was something different in his eyes now, a small spark of determination, however faint. Maybe it was the beginning of something new. Maybe it wasn't. But Emma had a feeling that, for Jack, this moment would stay with him for a long time. As he stood to leave, he looked at her again, his expression more sincere than it had ever been. "Thanks, Emma," he said, his voice thick with emotion. I don't know what's going to happen next, but you've given me something I haven't had in a long time, hope." Emma watched him walk out of the diner, his back straight and his steps a little firmer than usual. She couldn't predict the future, couldn't say for sure if he would find the peace he was looking for, but for the first time, she believed he was on the right path. And that, she realized, was enough. Have you ever felt like you couldn't escape your past? How did you find the courage to move forward? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The following week felt like a strange mixture of hope and uncertainty. Emma saw Jack a few more times, each visit a little different from the last. He still had moments when the weight of his past seemed to pull him back, but something was shifting within him. He wasn't as closed off as he used to be. There was more openness in his eyes, more willingness to engage, and he was starting to ask questions about himself. Questions that made Emma believe he was finally ready to confront the truths he had buried for so long. It was a slow process, like watching a plant grow from the smallest seed. Sometimes it seemed like nothing was happening, and other times, Emma would catch glimpses of something new in Jack, something worth fighting for. One evening, as the diner began to quiet down after the dinner rush, Emma found herself lost in her own thoughts. She was wiping down the counter when she saw Jack walk in again. This time, there was something different about him. He wasn't just walking in like he was running away from something. He was walking in with purpose. "Hey, Jack," she greeted him as he approached the counter. Her voice was warm, but there was a flicker of curiosity in her eyes. "You're looking better. What's going on?" Jack smiled, but it was different than the smiles he had given her before. This one wasn't filled with the usual sorrow or uncertainty. It was genuine. "I've been doing a lot of thinking," he admitted, pulling a chair out and sitting at the counter, "about the things I said to you, about how I've been living my life. I realized I've been waiting for something big to happen, but I never did anything to make it happen." Emma leaned against the counter, waiting for him to continue. She had learned not to rush Jack, but to give him space to find his own way to the answers he needed. "And?" she asked, her voice soft but encouraging. "I've decided that I'm not going to wait anymore," Jack said, his voice more confident than she had ever heard it. "I've spent so much time hiding, so much time pretending like everything was fine when it wasn't. I've hurt people, including myself, but I'm going to try to change that." Emma felt a surge of emotion in her chest, a mixture of relief and hope. She had seen Jack struggle so much, and to hear him speak with such determination made her believe that this time, it was different. That's a big step, Jack," Emma said, trying to keep her voice steady. "But I believe you can do it." Jack nodded, his eyes looking down at the counter as though he were still processing everything he had just said. "I don't know where to start," he admitted, a hint of vulnerability in his voice. "But I want to try. I want to show up for the people I've hurt. I want to be the person I've always been afraid to be." Emma placed a hand gently on his, feeling the sincerity of his words. "You've already taken the first step, Jack. You're facing the truth. That's more than most people can do." Jack smiled again, a little more relaxed this time. "It's strange," he said softly. "I never thought I could change. I thought I was stuck, like I was always going to be the person I used to be. But now, it's like, I see a way out, and it doesn't feel as impossible as I thought." Emma nodded, feeling a sense of pride for him, even though she knew the road ahead wouldn't be easy. Change never was. But Jack was ready to face it, and that was the most important thing. They sat in silence for a moment, the weight of his words hanging in the air. Emma realized that Jack was starting to believe in himself in a way he hadn't before. He wasn't perfect, and he wouldn't be. But for the first time, he was willing to try, and that was enough. "So," Jack said, breaking the silence, "I've been thinking about what you said before about starting over. I don't know if I'll ever be able to make up for everything I've done, but I want to try. And maybe, just maybe, I can fix some of the things I've broken." Emma smiled, her heart swelling with emotion. "You don't have to fix everything, Jack. You just need to keep going, one step at a time." Jack stood up, a sense of purpose in his movements now. I will, he said, and I'm going to start by being honest. With myself, and with the people I've hurt. I don't know if it'll work, but I have to try. Emma watched him as he walked out of the diner, his shoulders back and his head held high. He wasn't the same man who had walked in so many weeks ago, lost and broken. This Jack, she realized, was someone who had finally begun to believe in the possibility of change. She didn't know what the future held for him or for her, but she knew one thing. Jack was no longer running from his past. He was facing it, and that was the most powerful thing he could do. What's the hardest part about facing your own mistakes? Do you think it's possible to change for the better? Share your thoughts with us below. Jack's decision to change wasn't an easy one, and it was clear that the road ahead was going to be long. But every time Emma saw him, she noticed something different. A slight shift in his posture, a more purposeful stride. It wasn't just the words he spoke, it was the quiet determination that now defined his actions. He was slowly but surely taking responsibility, facing his past and showing up, sometimes for himself and sometimes for others. A few days after their last conversation, Jack walked into the diner just as Emma was clearing the last of the breakfast dishes. He still had that determined look, but today, something else lingered in his eyes. Uncertainty. As he approached the counter, he seemed to hesitate, but then, just like before, he pulled out a chair and sat down. "Hey, Jack," Emma greeted him, noticing the weight of his expression. "Everything okay?" Jack ran a hand through his hair, looking at her with a mix of frustration and uncertainty. "I'm not sure," he admitted, the vulnerability in his voice unmistakable. "I've been trying to make amends, but it's harder than I thought. People don't just forgive you because you want them to." Emma leaned forward slightly, her tone soft but encouraging. "That's true. Forgiveness takes time, and it's not something you can control. What's important is that you're trying. That's all you can do." Jack looked at her, the corners of his mouth twitching in what might have been a smile, but it didn't reach his eyes. "I've been trying. I've apologized to a few people, but they don't believe me. They think it's just talk. And I get it. I do. I've hurt a lot of people." Emma nodded. "You can't change what happened, Jack, but you can change how you move forward. It's not about instant forgiveness. It's about showing them through your actions that you're committed to being different. Sometimes that takes longer than we want it to." Jack exhaled sharply, running his fingers over the top of his coffee cup. "I know, but it still feels like I'm carrying this weight around. Like no matter how hard I try, it's never going to be enough. Maybe I'm just not meant to be better." Emma studied him carefully. "I don't think anyone is ever just meant to be better," she said. "Being better takes work. It takes time. You're not going to undo everything overnight. But each step, even the small ones, matter. You're not alone in this, Jack." He looked at her, his eyes searching hers as though trying to figure out if she truly understood the gravity of what he was feeling. Emma saw the raw emotion there, the fear of never being good enough, the doubt that had lingered in him for so long. He was trying, but it felt like the universe was pushing back every time he took a step forward. "I feel like I'm walking through a fog," Jack confessed, his voice low. "Every time I think I'm getting somewhere, it feels like I'm just standing still, waiting for something to change." Emma smiled gently, the warmth in her voice comforting. "That fog? It's part of the process. It's not easy, and it doesn't always feel like progress. But one day, you'll look back and realize that the fog has lifted, even if you didn't see it happen." Jack stared at her for a moment, as if considering her words. He looked down at his hands, his fingers tapping nervously against the table. "I don't know if I'm strong enough for this. I don't know if I can keep going when it feels like no one believes in me." "You don't need everyone to believe in you right now," Emma replied, her voice steady. "You just need to believe in yourself. You've made a choice to be better. That's a big deal, Jack. Don't lose sight of that." For a long moment, Jack didn't say anything. He simply sat there, staring down at his cup, the weight of his internal struggle clearly written across his face. Emma could see the toll this was taking on him. Change, especially after years of hiding from the truth, wasn't easy. It was messy, it was slow, and sometimes it felt impossible. But there was something in his eyes now, a flicker of determination, even if it was small. I guess I'll keep trying, he said, his voice quieter now but resolute. Even if it's hard. Even if it doesn't feel like enough. Emma smiled, her heart swelling with pride. That's all anyone can do. One step at a time. As Jack left the diner that night, Emma couldn't help but feel a sense of quiet pride for him. The road ahead would still be full of challenges, but he had taken another step toward becoming the person he wanted to be. It wasn't easy, and it wasn't perfect, but it was real, and that was something worth fighting for. Have you ever felt like the journey toward change was too hard to keep going? How did you find the strength to continue? Share your experiences with us in the comments below. Jack's journey was filled with moments of uncertainty, but it also brought moments of clarity. There were days when he felt like everything he had been working for was finally starting to take shape, and then there were days when he questioned whether it was all worth it. The weight of his past still loomed over him, and no matter how many times he tried to make amends, the scars of his mistakes didn't fade easily. A few weeks had passed since their last conversation, and Emma had started to see a shift in Jack. He had become more consistent in his efforts, showing up at the diner every few days to talk, to listen, and to share what he was learning about himself. Sometimes the conversations were difficult, but they were always meaningful. Emma was proud of the progress he was making, but she knew that there was still a long way to go. It was late one evening when Jack walked into the diner, his face drawn and tired. There was a heaviness in his step that made Emma's stomach tighten with concern. She had seen him struggle before, but tonight, it seemed different. He was carrying something more than just the weight of his past. "Jack, what's going on?" she asked as he approached the counter. Her voice was gentle, but there was a note of worry in it. Jack didn't sit down immediately. Instead, he stood there for a moment, his eyes looking distant, lost in thought. When he finally spoke, his voice was hoarse, like he had been holding something in for too long. "I don't know if I can do this anymore," he said, his words heavy with the weight of defeat. "I've tried. I've really tried. But I feel like every step forward just pulls me back 2 steps." Emma felt her heart tighten in her chest. She had seen Jack fight so hard to change, and hearing him speak like this made her feel like the ground beneath him was slipping away. "Change is hard," Emma said, her voice soft and steady. "It's not a straight line. There are setbacks, and there are days when it feels like you're going in circles. But that doesn't mean you're not making progress." Jack looked at her, his eyes tired and filled with frustration. "I don't know if I can keep fighting. It feels like everyone's waiting for me to fail. They don't believe that I've really changed. They don't believe that I can." Emma felt a pang of sympathy for him. She understood what it felt like to want to prove yourself, but to be constantly doubted. She knew that Jack had been hurt by his past, but she also knew that he wasn't the same person anymore. He had made real efforts to change, and even though it hadn't been easy, he had shown courage. "You can't control what others believe," Emma said gently. "What matters is what you believe. You've already shown that you're willing to face the truth, to take responsibility. That's not something everyone can do." Jack sighed, running a hand through his hair as he sat down at the counter. He looked down at the mug in front of him, his fingers tracing the rim absently. "It's just hard, you know? It feels like no matter how much I do, it's never going to be enough. I'll never be good enough to fix everything I've broken." Emma could hear the pain in his voice, the defeat that had crept back into his soul. It was clear that the emotional burden he was carrying was becoming too much for him to bear. She placed her hand on his, offering him a sense of connection in the quiet moment. "You don't have to fix everything, Jack," Emma said softly. "You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep going. And when you fall, you get up again. One step at a time." Jack looked at her, his eyes searching hers for the truth in her words. For a moment, he didn't say anything. Then, with a quiet nod, he spoke again. "I don't know what's next," he said quietly, "but I can't keep running from this. I have to face it, no matter how hard it gets." Emma smiled, her heart swelling with pride for him. She knew that Jack wasn't just talking about his past anymore. He was talking about the future, the uncertain road ahead that was filled with both fear and hope. And for the first time, Emma believed that Jack was truly ready to walk that road, no matter where it led. "I'll be here, Jack," she said softly, "whenever you need someone to talk to, or someone to remind you that you're not alone." You're not in this by yourself. Jack smiled, his expression softer than it had been in days. Thanks, Emma, he said, his voice thick with emotion. That means more than you know. As Jack left the diner that night, Emma watched him go, her heart full of quiet hope. She knew the road ahead would be full of struggles, and there would be moments when Jack would doubt himself. But she also knew that he wasn't the same man who had walked into her diner months ago. He had come a long way, and the journey was far from over. But he was finally walking it with his head held high, ready to face whatever came next. Have you ever felt like you were at a crossroads in your journey? How did you find the strength to keep moving forward? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. The days passed, and while Jack was making progress in his personal journey, the weight of his past still hung over him like a cloud, blocking out the sunlight of his hope. Despite his best efforts to put things right, there were still moments when doubt crept in. He found himself questioning if all the hard work would ever be enough to erase the pain he'd caused, not just for others, but for himself as well. Emma watched him closely, noticing the subtle changes in his demeanor. He had become quieter over the past few days, and when he wasn't at the diner, she could sense a distance between them. She understood. Change didn't happen overnight, and the emotional toll was a heavy burden. But she couldn't ignore the sense that Jack was on the verge of something. Something big, something that could either break him or transform him. One evening, as the sun began to set and the diner grew quiet, Jack walked in, his usual confident stride replaced with a weary shuffle. He looked like he hadn't slept in days, and the lines on his face were more pronounced than ever. Emma set down the coffee pot she had been refilling and walked over to his usual spot at the counter. "Jack, you okay?" she asked, her voice laced with concern. "You look like you've been carrying the weight of the world on your shoulders." Jack gave a hollow laugh, his eyes flickering with frustration. "Feels like it," he muttered, staring down at his hands. "I've been trying, Emma. I've been working so hard to fix things, but I feel like I'm still running in circles. Nothing seems to change." Emma hesitated, knowing that this wasn't a problem she could solve with a few words. She took a seat across from him, giving him space to speak his truth. "It's hard," she said softly. "Sometimes, we work so hard to change, and it feels like the world just keeps pushing back. But that doesn't mean you're not making a difference, even if it's not obvious right away." Jack shook his head, a deep sigh escaping from his chest. "I don't know if I'm even the same person I was before. I've done so many things I regret, and I don't know if I can ever be enough. I just don't think I'm cut out for this. Maybe some people are meant for redemption, and others, maybe we're just meant to keep failing." The words stung, but Emma understood where they were coming from. She had seen that same self-doubt in herself before. The feeling that no matter how hard you tried, it would never be enough. That feeling of being unworthy of a second chance. But Jack wasn't the same person he was when he first walked into her diner. He had taken steps to change, even if those steps felt small or insignificant. And that, Emma knew, mattered more than anything. "You're wrong," Emma said firmly, her voice soft but resolute. "You're not meant to fail, Jack. You're meant to keep fighting, even when it feels like everything is falling apart. Redemption isn't about being perfect. It's about showing up, day after day, and continuing to try, even when it feels impossible." Jack's eyes met hers, and for a moment, Emma saw a flicker of hope. Just a glimmer, but it was there. "You don't know what it's like to feel like you've already failed before you've even had the chance to succeed," Jack whispered, his voice raw with emotion. "No, I don't," Emma agreed. "But I do know that you're not alone in this. You're not the only one who's ever felt like they're walking through the dark, hoping for a light at the end of the tunnel. And I know that, deep down, you're capable of more than you give yourself credit for." Jack was silent for a long moment, staring at the counter, the flickering overhead lights casting long shadows across his face. Emma could see the inner struggle he was facing, the fight between hope and despair, between the person he wanted to be and the person he feared he might always be. "I don't know if I'm strong enough," Jack murmured, the weight of his words settling between them like an anchor. "I don't know if I can keep going like this." Emma reached out, gently placing her hand on his. "You don't have to do this alone. I'm here, and I believe in you. You just need to take it one step at a time." There's no rush, no deadline. You don't have to be perfect. Just be real. For the first time in a long while, Jack looked up, meeting her eyes with a sense of quiet gratitude. His voice was barely above a whisper, but the sincerity behind his words was undeniable. Thank you, Emma. I don't know how to thank you for everything you've done for me. Emma smiled softly, her heart full of warmth. You don't have to thank me. You just have to keep going. That's enough. As Jack left the diner that night, there was a different energy about him. He was still uncertain, still carrying the weight of his past, but there was a flicker of something else in his eyes, a flicker of hope. For the first time, Emma felt like he might just be on the verge of something big, something life-changing, and she couldn't help but wonder if, after all this time, Jack had finally started to believe in himself. Have you ever felt like you were too far gone to change? How did you find the strength to push through those feelings? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. Jack's steps were slower in the days that followed his conversation with Emma. Though the weight of his past still clung to him, the spark of hope she had rekindled within him made the road ahead seem a little less daunting. He couldn't quite see where the path would lead, but for the first time in a long while, he felt like there was a path at all. The doubts that had clouded his mind were still there, but they were quieter now, easier to push aside. Emma noticed the change. Jack was no longer the man who stumbled into the diner with an uncertain look in his eyes, but a man who was learning to stand a little taller. She still saw the fragility in him, the fear that he might stumble again, but she also saw the determination to keep going, no matter how tough it got. One evening, as the diner started to wind down for the night, Jack walked in, his expression a little more serious than usual. There was something different about him, something she couldn't quite place. He sat down at the counter, his fingers tapping lightly on the surface, an unusual nervousness in his demeanor. "Hey, Jack," Emma said with a soft smile, placing a cup of coffee in front of him. "You look like you've got something on your mind." Jack met her gaze, and for a brief moment, his usual hesitation was gone. "Actually, yeah," he said, taking a deep breath. "I've been thinking a lot about taking a step forward. You've been right all along. I don't have to carry this weight forever." Emma raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "That's a big step, Jack. What do you mean?" "I've been invited to a meeting," Jack said, his words tinged with uncertainty but also a quiet sense of purpose. "A business meeting. An opportunity to present myself, to show that I'm serious about changing my life." Emma's eyebrows shot up. "A business meeting? That's amazing, Jack. What kind of opportunity?" "It's with a company that does outreach programs for people like me, people who've been through some hard times and are looking for a second chance. They want to talk to me about joining their project," Jack explained, his voice tinged with both excitement and apprehension. "I didn't think it was possible, but now it's real, and I don't know if I'm ready." Emma smiled, her heart swelling with pride. "Of course you're ready. You've worked hard to get here, Jack. You deserve this opportunity." But Jack shook his head, a shadow of doubt creeping into his eyes. "I don't know. It's one thing to talk about changing my life. It's another thing to actually step into something new, something that could change everything. I'm scared I'll mess it up." Emma placed a gentle hand on his arm. "I get it. Stepping into the unknown is always scary. But this is your chance, Jack. This is what you've been working for. You've shown you're committed to changing. You don't need to have all the answers right now. Just take the first step. You'll figure it out along the way." Jack's gaze softened as he looked at her, his fear mixed with something deeper, a sense of gratitude. "You really believe that, don't you?" "I do," Emma said, her voice steady and warm. "I've seen how much you've changed, and I believe in you." Jack took a long sip of his coffee, processing her words. After a moment, he nodded. "Okay," he said quietly, as if convincing himself. "I'll do it. I'll go to the meeting." Emma beamed at him. "That's the spirit. And remember, you're not alone in this. I'm right here." Jack smiled, a small but genuine smile that reached his eyes for the first time in days. "Thanks, Emma. I mean it. You've been a bigger help than you know." As the night drew to a close, Jack stood up to leave, the weight on his shoulders feeling just a little bit lighter. He still had a long road ahead of him, but tonight, for the first time in a while, he felt like he was walking in the right direction. Emma watched him go, her heart filled with quiet hope. She knew that this meeting, this opportunity, could be the turning point he had been waiting for. And she also knew that Jack had finally found the strength to believe in himself again. Have you ever been presented with an opportunity that terrified you? How did you overcome the fear and take the leap? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. The morning of the meeting arrived, and Jack felt the weight of it bearing down on him like never before. He had woken up earlier than usual, the nerves in his stomach swirling in chaotic patterns as he tried to prepare himself for what lay ahead. The coffee cup he held between his hands did little to settle his unease, and he found himself pacing the small apartment, back and forth, his mind racing with doubt. Emma had encouraged him to take it one step at a time, to not overthink it, but it was easier said than done. The opportunity before him felt like a giant leap, one that could either set him on a new path or crush him entirely. In his mind, the stakes were impossibly high, and the fear of failure gnawed at him relentlessly. He had come a long way from the man who had stumbled into Emma's diner months ago, uncertain of what his future held. Now, with this meeting, it felt like everything hinged on this moment. He had worked hard to get to this point, and yet, the fear of not being good enough was almost paralyzing. Taking a deep breath, Jack grabbed his jacket and pulled it on, his fingers trembling slightly as he buttoned it up. He had to go. He had to try. As he stepped out of his apartment, the cool morning air hit his face, fresh and bracing, offering a fleeting sense of clarity. For a moment, the world around him seemed still, and he could hear the soft sounds of the city waking up. The streets were just beginning to fill with the buzz of morning traffic, the hum of people starting their day. But Jack's thoughts were not with the city. They were back with the diner, with Emma, and with the life he had started to rebuild. In her words, he had found something he hadn't realized he needed: belief. She had given him the courage to keep moving forward, even when the weight of his past was still heavy on his shoulders. The thought of Emma brought a small smile to his face as he made his way down the street. She had always been there for him, offering both practical advice and emotional support. She had believed in him when no one else had. Jack knew that he owed it to himself, and to her, to at least give this opportunity a chance. The company was located in a modern office building, just on the edge of downtown. As Jack walked through the lobby, his heart raced again. The polished floors, the sleek glass walls, the soft murmur of business people talking. It was a world that felt foreign to him, one he had never imagined he could be a part of. But now, here he was. He checked in at the front desk, his voice a little unsteady as he gave his name. Jack Foster. I'm here for the meeting with the outreach program. The receptionist smiled warmly and nodded. Right this way, Mr. Foster. They're expecting you. As Jack followed the receptionist through the hallway, his mind spun in circles. He had no idea what to expect. Would they look at him and see a man who had failed? Or would they see someone who had changed, someone who was trying to make amends? The question lingered in his mind, gnawing at him, but he pushed it aside, telling himself to focus on the now. The meeting room was modern and simple, with a large table in the center and chairs neatly arranged around it. A few people were already seated, their eyes lifting as Jack entered. One of them, a middle-aged woman with short brown hair, stood and extended her hand. Mr. Foster, it's a pleasure to meet you. I'm Linda, and this is Paul and Rachel. We've heard a lot about you. Jack shook her hand, his grip firm, though his pulse raced. It's nice to meet you, he said, trying to keep his voice steady. Thank you for giving me this opportunity. Of course, Linda replied. We're always looking for people who are committed to making a difference. You've come highly recommended. Please, take a seat. Jack took a deep breath and sat at the table, trying to calm the nerves that still simmered beneath the surface. As the conversation began, he found himself speaking more freely than he had expected. Linda, Paul, and Rachel asked him about his background, about the work he had been doing to turn his life around, and about his goals for the future. It was clear that they weren't just interested in his qualifications. They wanted to know who he was as a person. At first, Jack stumbled over his words, unsure of how to express the depth of his journey. But as the meeting went on, he found his voice. He told them about his struggles, his time spent on the streets, and how he had been given a second chance by people like Emma. He spoke of his desire to help others like him, to give back in the way that had been given to him. "I know I've made mistakes," Jack said, his voice quiet but steady now. "But I've learned from them, and I'm committed to helping others who've gone through the same things. I want to show them that change is possible, that it's never too late to turn things around." The room was silent for a moment, and Jack held his breath, unsure of how his words had been received. Finally, Rachel spoke, her voice warm and encouraging. "Jack, your story is incredibly moving. It's clear that you're not just looking for a job, you're looking for a way to make a real impact. We believe you have what it takes to be a part of this program. We're impressed with your honesty, your commitment, and your desire to help others." Jack blinked, his chest tight with emotion. You really think I can do this?" Paul nodded. "We do. We see potential in you, Jack, and we're excited to work with someone who understands the challenges firsthand." The weight that had been pressing on Jack's chest lifted, just a little, as a sense of relief washed over him. It wasn't just a job offer. It was an opportunity to truly make a difference, to use his story and his experiences to help others. And for the first time in a long while, he felt like he had a purpose. As the meeting came to a close, Linda smiled at him. "We'll be in touch soon to discuss the next steps. But I think we're all on the same page here. You're exactly what we've been looking for." Jack stood up, a sense of disbelief mixed with gratitude flooding him. "Thank you. I won't let you down. I promise." As he walked out of the meeting room and into the bright afternoon sun, Jack felt like a different man. He wasn't just someone who had made mistakes. He was someone who had learned, who had grown, and who was ready to take the next step in his life. For the first time in a long while, he felt like he was exactly where he needed to be. What do you think is the most important thing when faced with a life-changing opportunity? How do you prepare for something that could change everything? Share your thoughts in the comments below. It had been a few days since Jack had left the meeting with the outreach program, and while the initial excitement of the opportunity had worn off, a sense of peace had settled into his heart. He was still waiting to hear back from the team, but a quiet confidence had replaced the constant worry that had plagued him for so long. For the first time, Jack felt like his life was on the cusp of something meaningful. The days after the meeting were filled with small steps forward. Jack continued working at the diner, and Emma's encouragement remained a steady source of motivation. She could see the transformation in him. His shoulders were less hunched, his smile more genuine, and his eyes sparkled with a kind of hope he hadn't had before. One evening, as the diner started to quiet down, Emma pulled Jack aside. He had just finished wiping down the counter, and she could see the tiredness in his eyes, though it was a tiredness born of effort rather than defeat. "You've been quieter than usual, Jack," Emma said, her voice soft, yet knowing. "Everything okay?" Jack hesitated for a moment, the words threatening to spill out, but feeling like too much to say all at once. Finally, he met her gaze and nodded. "I'm just thinking a lot about what's coming next," he admitted, his voice steady but uncertain. "The program? I haven't heard back yet, and I keep wondering if I'm actually ready for it." Emma smiled, placing a hand gently on his arm. "You've been ready for this for a long time. The fact that you've made it this far shows how much you've grown." Jack looked down at his hands, the simple truth of Emma's words resonating deep within him. "I'm scared, Emma. I mean, what if I mess up again? What if they see that I'm not enough, that I'm just a guy who's failed over and over?" Emma's voice was steady, but there was a hint of compassion behind it. "You're not a failure, Jack. You're a man who's had some heartbreaks, yes, but you've learned from them. That's what matters." They're not looking for perfection. They're looking for someone who's willing to keep going, no matter the odds. Jack felt the weight of her words, and he nodded slowly. He had heard her say things like this before, but today, they felt different, stronger. Maybe it was the fact that he was standing at a crossroads, unsure of what the future held, but for the first time in a long while, he didn't feel alone in it. "I'm just tired of being afraid," he confessed quietly. "Tired of letting my past control me." Emma's expression softened, and she reached out, giving his shoulder a reassuring squeeze. "Then don't let it, Jack. You've come so far already. It's time to let go of the fear. Whatever happens with the program, you've already proven you have what it takes. You've earned that. As they stood there, a comfortable silence enveloping them, Jack felt a warmth spread through him. Emma's belief in him had been a constant, steady force, and it was beginning to sink in. He was capable of more than he had ever realized. The fear that had once held him back was starting to dissipate, replaced by a quiet courage he hadn't known he had. Later that night, as Jack made his way home, he reflected on the changes he had experienced in the past few months. When he had first met Emma, he had been lost, drifting through life with no clear direction. But now, things were different. He had a purpose, a sense of direction that had been missing for so long. And it wasn't just about the outreach program. It was about everything that had led him to this point. The lessons he had learned, the struggles he had faced, and the small victories along the way. Jack's phone buzzed in his pocket as he walked, and he pulled it out, his heart skipping a beat when he saw the name on the screen. It was an email from Linda at the outreach program. With trembling hands, Jack opened the email, his eyes scanning the message quickly. His breath caught in his throat as he read the first few lines. Dear Jack, we are pleased to inform you that we would like to offer you a position within our outreach program. After careful consideration, we believe you have the qualities we are looking for: resilience, determination, and a genuine desire to help others. We are excited to have you join our team and look forward to working with you. Please contact us at your earliest convenience to discuss the next steps. Best regards, Linda Hartman, Outreach Program Coordinator. A rush of emotions hit Jack all at once. Relief, disbelief, joy. His heart pounded in his chest as a smile broke across his face. He read the email again, just to make sure he wasn't imagining it. He had done it. He had been given a chance, a real chance to make a difference, not just for himself, but for others who had been through what he had. The fear that had gripped him for so long began to feel insignificant now, a shadow that had been replaced by the bright light of possibility. Jack stood there for a moment, letting the reality sink in. He had been given a second chance, and this time, he wasn't going to waste it. Have you ever received an unexpected opportunity that changed the course of your life? How did it make you feel? Share your thoughts and experiences in the comments below. The next few days felt like a blur to Jack. The excitement from receiving the email had not worn off, but it had transformed into a sense of urgency, as if time was suddenly moving faster. He had officially accepted the offer from the outreach program, and now, the real work was about to begin. There was no turning back. Jack spent his evenings preparing for his new role. He read up on the organization, studied its mission and values, and familiarized himself with the tasks ahead. He knew it wouldn't be easy. Nothing worth doing ever was, but he was ready. This was the moment he had been waiting for, and he wasn't going to waste it. Emma had been thrilled when he told her the news. Her eyes sparkled with pride, and she gave him a warm hug, telling him how proud she was of how far he had come. It was moments like these, when someone believed in him so fully, that Jack felt a sense of belonging. He wasn't alone anymore. He had people who were rooting for him, people who saw the person he was becoming. You've worked so hard for this, Jack, Emma had said that evening, her voice filled with pride. I know you're going to do great things. Her words echoed in his mind as he sat in the small office the outreach program had assigned to him. It was nothing like the corporate buildings he had imagined when he first thought about changing his life. It was simple, modest even, but it felt right. There was a comfort in its humbleness. It was a place where real change could happen, not just for the people they were helping, but for him too. He sat at his desk, reading through the documents that had been left for him, but his mind kept wandering. He thought about the people he had met along the way, the ones who had helped him rise from the ashes of his past. He thought about Emma, about the diner, about everything he had been through. And most importantly, he thought about how he wanted to give back. His role at the outreach program wasn't glamorous. He wasn't there to make decisions or lead teams, but it was meaningful. Jack would be working directly with people who were in situations similar to his own, helping them navigate their struggles and find a path forward. And that was enough. The first few weeks were overwhelming. There were a lot of faces to learn, a lot of procedures to follow, and even more stories to listen to. But through it all, Jack never wavered. He found himself connecting with the people he was helping, listening to their stories with the same kind of understanding and empathy that Emma had shown him. It wasn't just about giving advice. It was about being present, about showing people that they weren't alone in their struggles. One afternoon, a young woman named Lily came into the office. She was in her mid-20s, with a tired, hollow look in her eyes that reminded Jack of the person he used to be. She was there for help, but the walls she had built around herself were thick. Jack could see the skepticism in her eyes as she hesitated at the door, unsure whether to walk in or turn around and leave. He had been there before, uncertain, unwilling to trust anyone. But Jack knew that the first step was always the hardest. He had to break through that wall, even if it meant taking it slow. "Hi, I'm Jack," he said, standing up from his desk and offering a warm smile. "I know it might feel like a lot right now, but we're here to help, no matter where you're starting from." Lily hesitated, then slowly took a seat across from him. Her eyes were guarded, but Jack could see the flicker of hope that she was trying to hide. It was the same spark he had seen in himself when he had first walked into Emma's diner all those months ago. "I don't know if I belong here," she admitted, her voice barely above a whisper. "I don't even know where to start." Jack nodded, remembering how lost he had felt back then. "I get it. I was the same way. But the important thing is you're here now. You're taking that first step, and that's all that matters." They talked for a while, Lily slowly opening up about her struggles. She had been living on the streets for a while, caught in the cycle of addiction and isolation. Her story was one Jack had heard before, but that didn't make it any easier to hear. It was a reminder of how fragile the human spirit could be, and how easy it was to lose sight of the future when the present was filled with pain. Jack shared his own story with her, about how he had ended up in the same place, how he had stumbled and fallen, and how he had found his way out. It wasn't about pretending everything had been easy, but about showing Lily that change was possible, even when it felt impossible. By the end of their session, Lily seemed a little lighter, a little less burdened. She had agreed to attend a support group the program was offering, and Jack felt a sense of accomplishment, not because he had solved all her problems, but because he had given her something that had been missing: hope. As Lily left the office, Jack watched her walk out into the world with a little more strength in her step. And in that moment, he realized something important. This was why he was here. It wasn't just about helping people find jobs or get off the streets. It was about helping them see that they were worth fighting for. And in the process, he was discovering something about himself that he had long since forgotten: his own worth. Later that evening, as Jack sat down at the diner with Emma, he couldn't help but smile. The day had been exhausting, but it had also been one of the most rewarding of his life. He had made a difference, no matter how small, in someone else's life. And in doing so, he had taken another step toward healing his own. "You did good today," Emma said as she set a cup of coffee in front of him, a knowing smile on her face. "I can see it in your eyes." Jack smiled back, feeling the warmth of her words sink deep into his heart. "Thanks, Emma. I'm starting to think that maybe, just maybe, I'm exactly where I'm supposed to be." Have you ever had a moment where you helped someone else, and it made a difference in your own life? How did it change you? Share your thoughts with us in the comments below. The days that followed felt like a whirlwind to Jack. Each day at the outreach program brought something new. Another story to hear, another person to help, another step on his own journey of self-discovery. At first, he had been unsure if he was making any real impact, but with each new person he connected with, he began to see the ripple effect of his efforts. Lily's progress was slow, but it was there. She showed up to the support group, just as she promised, and began to open up to others in ways she hadn't before. Jack was proud of her, but the real shift, the one that left the deepest mark on him, came when he met a man named Greg. Greg was in his 40s, a weathered figure with a rough exterior that spoke of years of hardship. He had been living on the streets for nearly 2 decades, caught in the cycle of homelessness, addiction, and isolation. His eyes were dull, and his voice was gruff, as if he had long since given up on finding anything worth fighting for. When he walked into the outreach program, he did so with his head hung low, as if he didn't expect anything to change. When Jack greeted him, Greg didn't meet his eyes. He barely spoke, simply sitting down in front of Jack and folding his arms across his chest. The walls Greg had built were thicker than anything Jack had encountered before. Jack took a deep breath, trying to find the right words to break through. He knew this wasn't going to be easy, but nothing worth doing ever was. "Hi, Greg. I'm Jack," he said, trying to sound as warm and approachable as possible. "I know it's not easy asking for help, but I'm here to listen. You don't have to do this alone." Greg's eyes flickered to Jack's for a moment, then quickly turned away. "I'm not interested in talking," Greg muttered. "Been through all this before. It doesn't matter." Jack could feel the bitterness in Greg's voice, the years of disappointment that had shaped him into the person he was. But Jack didn't flinch. He had been that person once, too. He understood the anger, the distrust. He had felt it in himself before, when he had been at his lowest. "I get it," Jack said quietly, his voice steady. "I've been where you are. I know what it's like to feel like nothing will ever change. But it can. It does. But only if we're willing to take that first step, even if it's just a small one." Greg shifted uncomfortably in his chair, clearly not ready to open up, but Jack didn't back down. He'd learned that sometimes it wasn't about forcing a breakthrough. It was about planting the seed and letting it grow at its own pace. The first session was silent for the most part, with Greg offering little more than grunted responses. But Jack didn't give up. He kept coming back, day after day, showing up for Greg the way Emma had shown up for him, the way the outreach program had shown up for him. Slowly but surely, Greg began to soften. He started showing up more regularly, though his reluctance was always apparent. But it was progress. Jack knew that true change would take time. He had learned that lesson the hard way. But as the days turned into weeks, something unexpected happened. Greg began to share, just a little bit at a time. At first, it was the smallest of details, memories of a time before everything went wrong. Then, it was a glimpse of hope, however faint, about the possibility of something better. Jack listened. He didn't try to fix Greg's problems, didn't offer solutions or judgments. He just listened. And sometimes that was enough. One evening, after their usual session, Greg surprised Jack by speaking more than he ever had before. He was still guarded, still defensive, but there was a crack in his armor. "I don't know if I can do this, Jack," Greg said quietly, his voice barely above a whisper. "I've tried to get clean before, tried to get a job, tried to get my life back. Every time, I fall back into the same hole." Jack leaned forward, his gaze steady and compassionate. "I know what it feels like to fall, Greg. Hell, I've been down so many times I lost count. But you know what? Every time I got up, I learned something new. Even the failures are part of the journey. You don't have to be perfect. You just have to keep going." Greg's eyes met Jack's then, really met them, for the first time. And in that moment, something shifted. It wasn't a miracle. It wasn't an instant transformation. But it was a moment of connection. A moment where Greg realized that maybe, just maybe, he wasn't beyond saving. Jack left that day feeling a sense of accomplishment, a sense of purpose that he hadn't known in a long time. Helping people like Greg wasn't about grand gestures or instant success. It was about showing up, day after day, offering compassion, and letting them know that they weren't alone. As Jack walked home that evening, the weight of the day's work settled into him. He had given a part of himself to others, and in return, they had given him something just as valuable. The knowledge that the road to healing was not a straight line, but a winding path filled with setbacks, growth, and, above all, hope. When he arrived at the diner later that night, Emma was there, as always, with a warm smile and a cup of coffee waiting for him. "You look like you've had a long day," she remarked, her eyes twinkling with curiosity. Jack sat down across from her, taking a deep breath. "I did, but it was a good day." Emma raised an eyebrow. "Good as in I made a difference good? Or, I'm still figuring it out good?" Jack chuckled. "A little of both. But I'm starting to think that maybe I'm not just helping people. I'm helping myself, too." Emma's smile widened, and she placed a hand over his. "I'm proud of you, Jack. I really am." For the first time in a long time, Jack felt truly proud of himself, too. He had come so far, and the journey wasn't over yet. But with each step, he was moving closer to the man he wanted to be. And that was enough. Have you ever been in a position where you felt stuck, but through persistence and support, you began to see hope? What was the turning point for you? Share your story in the comments below. The next few months were transformative for Jack. The work at the outreach program continued to challenge him in ways he hadn't expected, but it also gave him a sense of purpose that he had never known before. Each day, he witnessed moments of growth, sometimes small, sometimes monumental, that kept him going. It was the kind of work that made him feel like he was part of something bigger, something that mattered. Jack's relationship with Emma had also deepened during this time. They had shared countless meals together, talking late into the night about their hopes, their dreams, and their fears. Emma had always been his sounding board, the person who believed in him when he didn't believe in himself. But now, Jack was beginning to see their friendship evolve into something more. He couldn't ignore the way his heart would race when she smiled at him, or the way her laughter filled the empty spaces of his world. Emma had been a constant presence, and somewhere along the way, she had become much more than just a friend. One rainy afternoon, as Jack was leaving the outreach center, he received a phone call from Lily. She had been part of the program for a few months now, and though her journey had been difficult, she had shown incredible progress. The call wasn't unusual. She had reached out a few times before, but this time, there was an edge to her voice that Jack hadn't heard before. "Jack, I don't know what to do," Lily said, her voice shaky. "I've got a job interview tomorrow, and I don't know if I can do it. What if they don't hire me? What if I mess everything up?" Jack paused, his hand gripping the phone tighter. He understood the fear she was feeling. It was the same fear that had almost paralyzed him when he first started the outreach program. But this time, he was no longer the one paralyzed by his own doubts. He was the one who could offer reassurance, who could be the voice of hope. "Lily," Jack said, his voice calm but firm, "you've worked hard to get here. You've made so much progress. Remember, it's not about being perfect. It's about showing up, giving it your best, and believing in yourself. You're ready for this." There was a brief silence on the other end of the line, followed by a soft sniffle. "Thanks, Jack. I just needed to hear that. You've got this, Lily. Just walk in there, be yourself, and trust that everything will fall into place." The call ended with Lily sounding more confident than when she had first called. Jack felt a sense of pride in her strength, even though he knew the road ahead would still be full of challenges. It always was. But the fact that she had made it this far, that she was even considering a job interview, was a huge step forward. The following day, Jack received a text from Lily. She had gotten the job. Jack smiled as he read the message, feeling a warmth spread through him. It wasn't just about the success, though that was a significant milestone for Lily. It was about the journey she had been on, and the fact that Jack had been there for her along the way. Later that evening, as he sat down to dinner with Emma, Jack shared the news with her. Her eyes lit up with pride, and she reached across the table to give his hand a squeeze. "I knew she could do it," Emma said, her voice full of admiration, "but it was your belief in her that made the difference." Jack shrugged modestly. "I just told her what I wish someone had told me when I was in her shoes, that it's okay to be scared, but you don't have to let the fear control you." Emma smiled, her gaze softening. "You've come a long way, Jack." He met her eyes, and for the first time in a while, he let himself feel it. He had come a long way. The fear and doubt that had once defined his life were no longer as powerful as they had been. He had found a strength inside himself that he hadn't known existed, and more than that, he had learned how to help others find their own strength. "I couldn't have done it without you, Emma," Jack said quietly. "You've been there for me every step of the way." Emma squeezed his hand again, her smile gentle. "I'm proud of you, Jack. I always have been." The weight of her words settled on him like a warm blanket. It wasn't just the success he had found at the outreach program, or the progress he had made with his clients. It was the relationships he had built along the way, the ones that had helped him heal and grow. Emma had been there for him when he was at his lowest, and now, as they sat together sharing this moment, Jack realized that she had become more than just a friend. She had become his anchor. The next few weeks were filled with small victories, both for the people Jack was helping and for himself. Greg had made more progress than Jack had expected, showing up consistently to the outreach sessions and beginning to take small steps toward sobriety. There were setbacks, of course, but each time Greg stumbled, Jack was there to remind him that it was okay to fall as long as you kept getting up. One day, as Jack was wrapping up a session with Greg, the man looked at him with a mixture of gratitude and vulnerability. I'm not sure I would have made it this far without you, Greg said, his voice cracking with emotion. I know I've been a pain in the ass, but you've always been there, even when I didn't deserve it. Jack smiled, feeling a deep sense of fulfillment. Greg, you're doing the hard work. I'm just here to help guide you when you need it. You've got it in you. Greg nodded, a faint smile tugging at the corners of his mouth. I think I'm starting to believe that. Jack left that day with a sense of accomplishment, knowing that Greg was on the path to healing. But it wasn't just about Greg, it was about Jack too. He had come to understand that his purpose was not just to help others, but to help himself in the process. The act of giving, of being there for someone else, had brought him a sense of fulfillment that he had never thought possible. That night, as he sat at the diner with Emma, he realized something else. He wasn't just helping people find their way. He was finding his own path, too. Have you ever experienced a small win that made a big difference in your life? What did it teach you about yourself? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The days blurred together, each one bringing a new lesson, a new challenge, and a sense of growth. Jack had found himself more content than he had ever been, but the work he was doing was not without its toll. Helping people, guiding them through their struggles, also meant confronting his own. The people he helped, the lives he touched, each served as a mirror to his own past. They reminded him of the dark places he had been, the times when hope seemed out of reach. But now, the light at the end of the tunnel didn't seem so far. Jack spent more time with the people he was helping. He visited Greg at a small halfway house where he had started living after months of sobriety. He continued to support Lily as she settled into her new job. And he spent his evenings at the outreach center, always looking for new ways to connect with the community. But there was something new emerging. It wasn't just about Jack anymore. It was about the ripple effect, the way his actions, no matter how small, seemed to be influencing others in ways he hadn't anticipated. One afternoon, as he was working with a group of new clients at the outreach program, he noticed a familiar face in the crowd. It was Emma. She had come to check on him, but as soon as Jack saw her, he knew she wasn't just there for a visit. She had a purpose. Emma had a way of making her presence felt, and today, her eyes sparkled with excitement. I've been thinking about something, she said, pulling up a chair next to Jack. Jack raised an eyebrow, intrigued. What's that? I've been following your work here, she began, and I think it's time for me to get involved. I want to help too. Jack was taken aback. You want to work here? Emma nodded. I've been volunteering at a shelter, but I think I can do more. I've seen what you've done, Jack. You've shown me that even the smallest actions can make a huge difference. I want to be a part of that. For the first time in months, Jack felt his heart swell with pride, not just for the work he had done, but for the way it had inspired someone else to join the cause. Emma had always been there for him, but now, she was taking a step toward making an impact of her own. It wasn't just Jack who had grown. It was the people around him. Emma, I don't know what to say, Jack replied, his voice thick with emotion. This means the world to me. You've always believed in me, but now you're going to help others the way you've helped me. Emma smiled, her eyes softening. We help each other, Jack. That's what this is all about. With Emma now actively involved in the outreach program, Jack felt a renewed sense of purpose. He wasn't alone in this journey anymore. Together, they could reach even more people, help even more lives, and make an even greater impact. But there was more to the ripple effect than just Emma. The program had begun to grow. People who had once walked through the doors unsure of themselves were now standing tall, ready to give back. Jack saw former clients helping others, offering advice and encouragement. He saw them teaching new arrivals how to navigate the complex emotions that came with rebuilding a life. It was a community in the truest sense of the word. Greg had become a mentor to others, sharing his story with anyone who would listen. He spoke with such conviction, his voice steady and full of wisdom born from hardship. I was lost, he would say. I didn't think I'd ever get out. But then I realized that I didn't have to do it alone. We all have something to give, even when we feel like we have nothing left. Greg's words resonated with everyone in the room. Jack had witnessed firsthand the transformation that had taken place in him, and now Greg was paying it forward. Lily, too, had come a long way. She was thriving in her new job, and was starting to rebuild the relationships that had been damaged during her struggles. She still had moments of doubt, but she no longer let those moments define her. Instead, she reached out to others who were going through similar challenges, offering the support she had once needed herself. "I didn't know if I was ready for this," Lily said one evening as she and Jack shared a coffee. "But now I can see that I am. I'm ready to help others, just like you helped me." Jack smiled, his heart full. "You're already doing it, Lily. Every step you take is a step toward helping someone else take theirs." The more Jack reflected on the impact of his work, the more he realized how interconnected everything was. The help he had given, the guidance he had offered, it had created a chain reaction, ripples in the lives of those he had touched. And it wasn't just his own journey that had been transformed. It was the collective journey of everyone involved. Emma's presence in the program was a reminder of the power of relationships. She had been there when Jack was at his lowest, and now they were standing side by side, working together to make a difference. She had shown him what it meant to be selfless, to give without expectation, to show up for others no matter the cost. The journey Jack had started months ago, feeling lost, disconnected, and uncertain, had led him to this moment. He had found his purpose, and in doing so, he had helped others find theirs. But perhaps the most profound realization came when Jack realized that the ripple effect wasn't just limited to the people he worked with. It had touched Emma, Greg, Lily, and even himself. It had come full circle. As he sat in the diner with Emma, the weight of everything he had learned settled in. It wasn't about the big moments, the dramatic transformations. It was about the everyday acts of kindness, the small victories, and the people who believed in each other, even when the world seemed like it was falling apart. "You know," Jack said, his voice quiet, "I never thought I'd be here. I never thought I'd make a difference." Emma looked at him, her eyes warm. "You have, Jack. You've made more of a difference than you'll ever know." Jack smiled, realizing that the true power of change didn't lie in one person, one moment, or even one action. It was in the way people came together, supported each other, and created a ripple effect that spread out into the world. Have you ever experienced the ripple effect of kindness or support in your life? How did it change you or someone else? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The weeks continued to unfold like pages in a book, each day bringing new challenges and triumphs. Jack had become a familiar face in the community, known for his unwavering support and the dedication he poured into his work at the outreach program. But despite the progress, despite the sense of fulfillment he had found, Jack knew that there was one thing he still hadn't fully confronted: the truth about himself. The last few months had been transformative. He had made a difference in countless lives, and yet, there was an undeniable feeling lingering deep within him. A feeling that he was still carrying something, a burden from the past that he hadn't yet let go of. It wasn't the guilt from his past mistakes, although that was part of it. It was something more complex, something that tied his identity to the very foundation of the man he had become. One rainy evening, after a particularly difficult day at the outreach center, Jack found himself sitting at a small table in the diner. The weather had been dreary all day, mirroring the fog that seemed to cloud his mind. He stared out the window, watching as the rain tapped gently against the glass, lost in thought. Emma sat across from him, her brow furrowed as she watched him carefully. She could tell that something was weighing on him, and it wasn't the first time she had noticed him retreat into his own head. "Jack," she said softly, her voice breaking through his reverie. "What's going on? You've been distant for days now." He took a deep breath, running his hand through his hair, frustration and confusion rising to the surface. "I don't know, Emma. It's just, everything feels like it's building up. The work here, the people we're helping, it's all so much bigger than I ever imagined. But sometimes I wonder if I'm really cut out for this. What if I'm not the right person to be leading this? What if I'm just pretending?" Emma's eyes softened with understanding. She had seen this side of Jack before, the self-doubt that had plagued him for years. "Jack, I've seen you help so many people. You've been there for them in ways that most people can't even imagine. You're making a difference. You're exactly who these people need." Jack's eyes flickered, but the doubt didn't completely leave him. "I know, but it's more than that. It's about me, Emma, about how I see myself in all of this. For so long, I've been running from who I really am. And now, I'm starting to realize that I can't keep doing that. The past still haunts me, and it's affecting everything I do. I feel like I'm holding on to this mask, pretending to be someone I'm not. I'm afraid that if people really knew who I was, what I've done, they wouldn't trust me. They wouldn't look at me the same way. There was a long pause, and for the first time in a long while, Emma didn't know what to say. Jack's vulnerability cut deep, and she could feel the weight of his words. She had always known that Jack carried pain, but hearing him admit it out loud was something different. She reached across the table, placing her hand on his. "Jack," she said gently, "you don't have to carry that burden alone. I'm here for you, always. But you have to face it. You can't keep hiding from your past. You don't have to be perfect, Jack. You don't have to pretend to be someone you're not. All you have to do is be real. Be yourself." Jack looked at her, his eyes full of emotion. He had been so afraid of confronting the past, so afraid that it would unravel everything he had worked for. But Emma was right. He couldn't keep running from it. If he was going to move forward, he needed to face the truth about himself, about the mistakes he had made, and about the man he was trying to become. "I don't know if I can do it," Jack said, his voice barely above a whisper. "You can," Emma replied firmly. "You've already done so much. You've already come so far. The hardest part is letting go of the past. But once you do that, you'll be free to be the person you've always been meant to be." Jack looked down at his hands, his mind racing. Emma's words were both a comfort and a challenge. He knew she was right, but the fear still lingered. What would happen if the people he cared about knew the truth? Would they still believe in him? Would they still see him as someone worthy of their trust? The answer, he realized, didn't come from anyone else. It had to come from within himself. Later that night, Jack sat alone in his apartment, the silence enveloping him. He had been pacing back and forth, the weight of his thoughts pulling him deeper into his own mind. It was time to confront the one thing he had been avoiding for so long. He grabbed his phone and scrolled through his contacts until he found the number he had been putting off calling. It was his old friend, Ethan, the one person who had been there through everything, the one person who knew Jack's past better than anyone else. With a deep breath, Jack dialed the number. "Ethan," he said when the call connected. "It's Jack. We need to talk." The conversation that followed was long, raw, and painful. Jack spoke of the mistakes he had made, the guilt he had carried for so many years. He told Ethan everything, the moments he had tried to forget, the choices he had regretted. And as he spoke, Jack felt something shift inside him. The burden that had weighed so heavily on his heart began to lift, piece by piece. Ethan was quiet for a long time, but when he finally spoke, his voice was steady. "Jack, you've been carrying this weight for too long. It's time to let it go. I'm proud of you, man. You've come a long way, and you're doing something good now. Don't let your past define you. You're not that person anymore." Jack felt a tear slip down his cheek as Ethan's words sank in. It wasn't easy. It would never be easy. But in that moment, Jack understood. The truth was painful, but it was also liberating. By acknowledging his past, he could finally move forward, without the fear, without the shame, without the burden. When Jack hung up the phone, he felt lighter than he had in years. He had faced the truth, and in doing so, he had set himself free. Have you ever had to confront a difficult truth about yourself? How did it change you? Share your thoughts in the comments below. The weeks that followed were filled with a quiet kind of healing for Jack. He continued to work at the outreach program, his connection to the community deeper than ever before. The faces of the people he helped, the ones he had come to know so well, no longer felt like strangers. They were his equals, his friends, and their struggles mirrored his own in so many ways. But something had changed. The burden of his past no longer held him hostage. Jack had found a kind of peace, not in erasing the mistakes he had made, but in accepting them. The truth was, he realized, not something to fear, but something to embrace. It was through confronting his flaws, his regrets, and the choices he had made that he was able to grow and help others do the same. Emma had been a constant source of support during this period. She had seen the shift in him, the quiet strength that came from his vulnerability. And while Jack had learned to trust others more, he had also learned to trust himself. One afternoon, as they sat in the small park across from the diner, Emma looked over at Jack, her eyes filled with pride. "You know," she said thoughtfully, "I've been thinking about something." Jack raised an eyebrow, intrigued. "What's that?" "You've come so far, Jack. You've done so much for so many people, but I think you're ready for something more. You're ready to take this to the next level." Jack turned to her, his expression puzzled. "What do you mean?" Emma smiled. "I'm talking about expanding the outreach program. What if we created a space where people could not only get help, but also give back? A place where those who've been through the toughest struggles can become mentors, guides for others who are just starting out." The idea hit Jack like a bolt of lightning. It was exactly what he had been searching for, a way to create a cycle of support and growth, where people who had experienced the pain of addiction, homelessness, and loss could give back and help others avoid the same pitfalls. It was a vision he had never fully articulated before, but now it felt like the next logical step. "I love it," Jack said, his voice filled with excitement. "It's perfect. We can create a space where people can not only heal but also find purpose. It's about building something sustainable, something that lasts." Emma nodded, her smile widening. "Exactly. It's about giving people the opportunity to not just recover, but to thrive, to realize they have value, that they can make a difference." The two of them began brainstorming ideas for the program, how they could structure it, and how to get the word out. The more they talked, the more the vision became clear. It wasn't just a place for people to come and get help. It was a place where they could rediscover their worth and find their calling. As they worked together, Jack felt an overwhelming sense of gratitude. Gratitude for Emma's unwavering belief in him, for the community he had built, and for the journey that had brought him here. The road had been long, but it had led him to a place where he could finally see the bigger picture. The program began to take shape. Jack reached out to local businesses, schools, and community leaders to spread the word. He partnered with counselors, social workers, and former clients who were now willing to give back, to mentor the next generation of individuals seeking help. Soon, the outreach center transformed into something bigger, something more powerful than Jack could have imagined. It became a hub for hope, a place where people could come to heal, to learn, and to contribute to something greater than themselves. It was a reflection of Jack's own journey, where the pain of the past could be transformed into something beautiful, something lasting. One evening, as Jack stood in front of a group of new arrivals at the program, he looked around the room and realized just how far he had come. He wasn't just the guy who had made a few mistakes. He was someone who had learned from those mistakes and used them to build something meaningful. "Welcome," Jack said, his voice steady but filled with emotion. "You're here because you've made the decision to change, to take control of your life. And we're here to support you every step of the way. You're not alone." The words felt real now, not just something he said to motivate others, but something he truly believed. They weren't alone. None of them were. And he wasn't either. The journey had started with a single decision to help someone in need. A homeless man who turned out to be someone far more significant than Jack had ever imagined. But that moment, as simple as it was, had sparked a chain reaction. It had led Jack to a place of understanding, of self-awareness, and ultimately, of purpose. As the program flourished, so did Jack. He had found his calling, not in some grand gesture, but in the small acts of kindness, in the everyday choices to show up and be present for others. And in turn, those he had helped were now showing up for themselves and for each other. As he watched the people around him, Greg, Lily, Emma, and so many others, find their own sense of purpose and fulfillment, Jack knew that this was just the beginning. There would always be more work to do, more lives to touch, and more challenges to overcome. But Jack had learned that he didn't have to do it alone. The ripple effect of kindness, of support, of giving without expectation, those were the things that would sustain him, that would keep him moving forward. And in the end, that was all he needed. What's one small action you've taken that ended up making a bigger impact than you expected? Share your story with us in the comments below.